Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 242nd episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And of course, this month's podcast series is all about decolonisation. And today I'm going to be talking about decolonising the curriculum, in particular with a focus on higher education. And speaking of doing things differently and conversations on race and mental health, have you watched my TEDx talk? It's about the connection between culture, race, and mental health in the workplace. And it's something you can watch in your break as it's just 12 minutes long. The link is in the show notes, but I'll also give it to you here. It is bit.ly/TEDx Wolves, WOLVESLO. I really hope you enjoy it because it was a labor of love. And if you did, please leave a positive comment on YouTube, share, and like. Also, don't forget to connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. So last week I talked about how to apply the principles of decolonising in the workplace. And today I'm going to be talking about education and the curriculum or curricula plural. So I'm going to be using James Lindsay's definition from the article Academic Questions 33 Decolonising the Curriculum, and I've included the link in the show notes. And he talks about three key areas, first of all. Number one, what is the curriculum or what is curricula and in which context? Two, what could possibly be meant by decolonising it? And three, how did the curriculum come to be colonised? So you might like to think about those three questions, but in essence, decolonising the curriculum is about dismantling the values that are present in what might be known as the hidden curriculum. So things like methodological rigour, rationality, ethics, and replacing them with a new way of looking at things. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that decolonisation is a completely different process than diversifying. There are overlaps, but it is actually different. And the way I would frame this is that decolonising requires substantial and deep inward retrospection and challenge of existing systems. So an organization, curriculum setting organizations and discussions really have to look inwards and challenge themselves as to why is this the way that we've always done things? Because it entails reversing the assumption that European thought and centralizing curriculums on this historical way of doing things is the right way. So in some senses, decolonising is flipping things on their head and detracting from the usual way of doing things and the usual suspects and really trying to challenge yourselves to do things differently. I would say diversifying can be part of that. So if we think about adding Black authors to certain curriculums or looking at curricula, or looking at how things are taught around algorithm. So that's an Arabic word. So that could be something that's added to a curriculum explaining that. So diversifying, I say, would be adding to and looking at those different perspectives. And then I also wanted to mention inclusive curriculum. So inclusive curriculum is about aiming to support the learning needs and the learning methodologies and the preferences of all students. So this is looking at, might be specific learning needs, it might be people in certain protected characteristics, and it does take into account this idea that not all students are going to learn the same way, so there are going to be differences between peer to peer. And inclusive curriculum, in particular inclusive curriculum design, looks at making positive changes to the curriculum or curricula for the benefit of all students. So we could think of it as an overlapping Venn diagram where there will be a point where inclusivity, decolonisation, and diversifying touch. But we're focusing on decolonisation, and that is deep work. And I wanted to make that really clear because I've seen lots of articles talking about decolonisation when actually it's about diversifying. I've also seen pieces and information that talk about decolonising and diversifying in the same breath. So we've got to be really clear about that. And decolonising is integral to an inclusive curriculum. So we've got inclusive curriculum design because you have to think about what students need in order to think about what students' needs might be. And we're thinking particularly about global majority students who may have come from historical colonization. And remember, we don't often always know our own histories inside out. And it seeks to address and recognize the legacies of disadvantage, assumptions, stereotypes, prejudice, racism, that have arisen from this historical domination by the global north, the legacy of the global north, and in the inherent whiteness and whiteness as rightness away from the disciplines. So it contributes to inclusive curriculum. So I say that would inclusive curriculum design, it's integral to it. And it's also important to say it's not about deleting existing knowledge or history, because I know people get very angry about that. So, why would we remove statues when they're an important part of history? Yes, but should they be in a place where people who have killed thousands should be glorified? But it is about embracing knowledge systems and the way in which things were remembered. So this to me very much links with culture, the way that cultural systems process and store information. So how do we need to change that? Not delete it, but should it be given the same standing or importance that it always was? So in 2020, education charity Teach First research found that young people in England could leave secondary school without studying a novel or play written by a Black or a global majority author. They found that texts for GCSE English literature set by the country's largest exam boards did not feature a single book by a Black author at that time. And part of that is to do with the drive by Michael Gove to get most Black and global majority authors off the curricula. So this and other findings show that, English literature curricula at GCSE level in England, so I cannot comment on Northern Ireland, Scotland or Wales, taught in most schools are not representing the multitude of perspectives and backgrounds that make up the country's diverse population. And I remember, doing my GCSEs many, many years ago, and just being bored to death by the text. I cannot stand Jane Austen, and there was no real scope. And the book that I ended up doing a piece on was Heat and Dust, which was Ruth Brower Jubvala, and that's not. I wonder what I would think if I read it now. But that was the only thing I could connect with, being a South Asian diaspora person at the time. I did really well in that essay because, and I wasn't particularly good at English literature, but because I was able to draw, I did a comparison between that book, Heat and Dust, and The Ice Palace by Scott F. Fitzgerald. So really interesting about women's role going from different climates and environments. And of course, The Ice Palace is to do with America, this American South, white perspectives, and going to the American North. But yeah, so even something like that, and that was a long time ago, and the fact that we're still having these conversations really scares me. I think white curriculum, the impacts of it, the damaging impacts, can be seen far and wide. So we see things like UCL had to rename many lecture theatres. They started that process in 2020 because, of course, Francis Galton, the one of the key people in evolution theory, is a cousin of Darwin, very much around this nonsense about categorizing people based on skin color. He was someone we would now think of as deeply racist. He was a eugenicist, to the distinct absence of academics from global majority backgrounds that are not featured on reading lists, that are not talked about in terms of their research and the impact and theories that have been made popular in the global north that were actually started in what is now the global south. And this is the other thing. These terms, global north and global south, are relatively recent, not acknowledging the power and the wealth and the educational standing of countries that we now say, oh, they're in the global south. And of course, we know that global majority students are going to feel the effects of a white curriculum. So finding themselves underrepresented in terms of the information they have to absorb, study, regurgitate, present on, our ancestral narratives and histories are completely omitted from mainstream discourse. The white curricula is also one of the major contributors to what we call what's called the BME attainment gap, but I'm calling the global majority attainment gap, which is where particularly British global majority students are 20% less likely to achieve a first or 2-1 degree classification compared to their white counterparts. And this has been a conversation that we've been having in the sector for at least 20 years. Despite arriving at university with the same grade. So this has a very wide-reaching impact and bakes in inequity and inequality. So let's go back to this question of what is curriculum, what is curricula, i.e. what is taught. So the traditions of knowledge in a particular field, how recent developments are brought into the current context of a subject, research expertise of a particular scholar, and whose work gets spread and the ideas spread, who gets chosen, ideas and perspectives that center or normalize construction of the global north or whiteness as a basic reference point for human society. Performatively, a very significant presence for scholars racialized as white, gendered as male, and located often by virtue of class privileges within a limited range of global north institutions. And then pedagogy, and normally, within universities, it's more on that pedagogy adult learning border refers to how curricula is taught. So the design of the modules, the programs and learning outcomes, the mode of delivery, contact hours, classroom environment, student preparation work, assessment and feedback, and of course the wider school or educational environment. So I really hope you're enjoying the content of this podcast and you want to keep up to date. If so, then why not join my newsletter? When you join, you'll receive my free white paper on inclusive language and mental health, and that link is bit.ly/ILMHCK. It's also in the show notes. So I think it's helpful to think about that. What is the subject? What is the depth? And then how it's taught. And you can see again the Venn diagram between decolonizing, diversifying, and inclusivity, particularly in the pedagogy aspect. So what can you do? I think this is the key question. And if you listen to episode 240, the reason I decided to do this series is because I met two academics who said to me, we went on some workshops, but we really don't understand what we do. We teach modern foreign languages. And actually, of course, if we're teaching that, we are thinking about this. So that's interesting. I think one of the first things is to look at the language. So when you start to do research in this area, light touch research, you'll see phrases like non-white, non-European, post-colonial. Actually, why are we not saying global majority, global south, global people? Freedom literature. I don't know why it's called post-colonial, because if you think about the legacy of a particular country, they have history dating way back, but way before they were colonized. So I really think one of the key things is to challenge ourselves and push ourselves away from this terminology. I think it's incredibly damaging because it becomes normalized. Sometimes you do have to use non-white for certain comparators, but we shouldn't be using non-white or non-European languages. We should be saying global languages. You've got Indo-European languages. You've got languages from the continent of Africa. You've got indigenous South American languages. We need better terms, and I think that's really, really important. And then there are things around, let's have a really good hard look at the actual curricula or curriculum. How was it developed? What was it based on? Why do we always do it like this? And really think about the profile and break it down bit by bit. Now, of course, if you're listening to this and it's more from a school perspective, in individual schools in the UK, whether it's primary or secondary, you don't have a huge amount of control over that. There are set standards, particularly for state schools, but you can bring this up with your union. I know that there are working groups around this. I know that there are lobbying groups writing to the DFE. So this is something that you don't have to do on your own. I know there are lots of teachers working on this. So this is something that that I think we all need to raise the profile. If you're a parent, whether that's biological, adoptive, whatever kind of parent or carer or guardian, this is something that you can all do. And if you're a school governor, this is something that could be raised. And so it is to think about this program, the curricular design and delivery, and how does it encourage people to engage with text, information, ideas from the global majority world? And how do we also bust myths? So I was talking to a friend I hadn't seen for a very long time on Friday for 10 years, and she popped over on her way. She was driving and she popped over to my house doing a long journey, and we started talking about this. And she said, people send me these cartoons thinking that they're really funny, showcasing Iran in a terrible way. So one of the cartoons that she was sent was someone from the IRG, the Iranian government, and they were standing on a stool, and it was a computer mouse, and they were quivering from it. And she said, isn't that ridiculous? Like, they don't realize that the IRG are really using technology, not in a helpful way, but to do this, to do the things that they're doing that are really having a very detrimental effect on Iranian citizens, right? So this idea that, look at these stupid people with their head coverings and turbans and their long jubbas, actually we need to be busting that myth and looking at actually the history. This is one example of Iran and its poets and the Chalamet and the history around that. Now, I'm not saying you'd want to do that in every course, but these cartoons, let's think about flipping them on their head and go, well, where is this coming from? Because let's look at the historical context about it. And that's one example. So what about the use of a variety of sources in curricula? And this can be across all subjects. This often people think about English reading lists. They go to English reading lists, but you can think about it in terms of art. You can think about it in terms of particularly, fashion and textiles and all the different techniques from a number of countries and cultures. we can think about it in terms of how language has evolved. So even when you learn a language from whichever part of the world, and of course they have their roots, and I think starting with that, actually the language tree is a really helpful example of doing that. Of course, maths and research and algebra is also an Arabic word. The origins of our numbers are Arabic. So, this is just a snapshot. And there's a very interesting story. There's a great TEDx talk about why does X represent, X is the number. Excellent TED talk. I'm so sorry, I can't remember the speaker who did it, but the origins of that, very, very interesting. And that is an example of this kind of continuation, how an idea starts somewhere and how it develops. And then it's almost like the global north have gone, oh yeah, this is all us. But it's not that clear cut. We know that ideas evolve, and that's not to say that people shouldn't take them and develop them, but please give credit where credit's due. And then the actual pedagogical element of it, or the teaching element, and I'm talking about, well, I'm using the word pedagogy, which is for young people, but andragogy, which is adult learning. And I think university is very much on that pedagogy, andragogy point for students. But if you think about exec education and those aspects, that tends to be much more andragogy. So what as the transparency about expectations, I think that's really important. And that really links with inclusive curriculum. How are people expected to demonstrate their learning and how it's assessed? So usually that is quite clear cut, but often I think that there needs to be different ways of measuring success, but also within the environment of learning. So you have things like flipped classroom and team-based learning, things that are going to, ways of learning that are going to cater to a more high context culture way of learning. If you want to know more about that, please check out podcast episode 105. And also, is there a way in which to have conversations and co-produce any of this? Now, of course, I know in state schools in England, that's not possible. The curriculum is set across the subjects. But in some cases, student panels and universities and student representation, I think if it can be done, and it can't be done across the board probably, but the opportunity for assessment discussions, co-production of modules, that's really, really useful. And also the ways in which the interaction within seminars, tutorials, lectures, again, not always possible because I know some lectures are up to 300-400 people, but how do they help engage students to actively participate, discuss, and break things down? And of course, when you do this work, it's not always easy, and students are coming with different perspectives. So before any of this starts, it's almost how do you have some pre-framing conversations in terms of both aspects for students coming in, particularly from the traditional student background, straight from A levels or having had one gap year, because of course you're having to bring people together from lots of different backgrounds and different perspectives in different parts of the country. But this does require time, as with all this work, but actually I don't think we have as much time as we think we do. So as much as you can't just change things overnight, there are things that you can do easily. And I think one of the things is to bring this up in any staff meetings and panels and really get external expertise in to support you with this. Because again, this isn't something that if it's 10 white people sitting around a table, it feels desperately uncomfortable. And you're going to say, oh, things are working really well. That's what happens. That's what we all do. That's human nature. So if you are going to make this conscious decision to change or to flip the script, you do need support doing that. As with last week's episode, it's going to be very, very uncomfortable because I think particularly in academia, there's a real sense of we are lovely people, we are nice people, we care about the world, we care about the impact of our research to improve lives. And whilst that's true, it's not a good bad binary. Racism, being a racist person doesn't mean you're all bad. It doesn't mean you are a member of the BNP or any right-wing group. We all have traits of everyday racism. And if you might say something racist, that doesn't make you a wholly bad person either, if you can reflect on it and have discussions and really look at where that's come from, for example. Now, I don't mean race hate speech. I mean, you might say to someone, well, where are you from? They say Birmingham. You go, no, but where are you really from? That's a microaggression. That's not appropriate. That doesn't make you a wholly bad person. But can you reflect on that and think, oh, that had the effect of pressing on a bruise when there is a power imbalance? So there's asking because you think you've got the right to know, and there's asking because you might be from a similar background and want to connect with someone, and that has a very different vibe to it. So just remember that confronting racial inequity and looking at the origins of knowledge and which knowledge is acceptable and which knowledge is seen as excellent is going to be desperately uncomfortable, especially when you've been in it for so long. And remember, whiteness isn't neutral, it's whiteness. British culture isn't neutral, it's British culture. And if you feel comfortable in it, that means you're part of it. And it's often when we can step out of that we go, oh, this feels a bit weird and different, and I don't know why it's been done differently. So how you really set the ground to have those, to acknowledge that and think about the support you might need. And as I said, really having these discussions with students, and getting support if you need that. And one really excellent resource that I found from 2018 is SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, Decolonising Learning and Teaching Toolkit. It is truly excellent. It also has some case studies, absolutely brilliant. And I don't think, these things, these conversations about decolonising the curriculum have never really stopped being talked about, but I think they get given more credence in some circumstances and less credence in others. And the conflation between diversifying, decolonising, and inclusivity does seem to be a bit of a problem. So I think getting really clear on that language, and of course there is a point where they all meet. So as we know with this kind of work, if you improve things in one area, it usually will positively impact the other areas. And please know that this is a journey. We can't undo 500 years of colonization, brutality in a day. Do fasten your seatbelts and get ready. And if this is a subject you'd like to know more about, remember that I run workshops, training sessions, and keynotes for organizations about decolonization, mental wellbeing, and anti-racism. So do get in touch with me at Layla, Leyla, at diverseminds.co.uk. I really hope you've enjoyed the show. And if you have, why not write me a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast from. And you can always email me. I'd love to hear from you. And I've also included a couple of links in the show notes. So the definition from James Lindsay and the really good article about decolonizing the curriculum from the US perspective. Manchester Met's professional services, reducing the decolonizing awarding gaps. Liverpool, University of Liverpool's Centre for Innovation Education, resources for decolonizing the curriculum. Really great Galdem article, Why is my curriculum white? The Novara Media article, Reasons the curriculum is white, and the SOAS teaching kit. And don't forget my podcast episodes 233 to 235, Addressing White Dominant Norms, which links to some of the areas that I've been talking about today. So thank you so much, everyone. And next week, we are going to look at decolonizing in arts and heritage. So do take care, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.